Get started. Welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society. I'm Kathy Jones, one of the Adult Services librarians, and tonight we have another wonderful author discussion for you. I do want to remind you that if you're watching the program on Zoom, there's a Q&A down at the bottom of the screen, so you're welcome to type in any questions you might have for our author, or if you're joining us on Facebook, put your questions in the chat. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can after the presentation's over. I also want to remind you that the Learned Owl, our local independent bookstore, is selling copies of tonight's book, and there will be a link in the chat for you if you'd like to purchase one. So tonight we have with us Alyssa Palombo, the author of the Borgia Confessions. Alyssa is also the author of The Violinist of Venice, The Most Beautiful Woman in Florence, and The Spellbook of Katrina Van Tassel. She's a graduate of Canisius College with degrees in English and creative writing. A passionate music lover, she's also a classically trained musician. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Alyssa Palombo.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Kathy and everyone at the Hudson Library for having me. Thanks to you all for attending. I'm so happy to be here. Tonight I'm going to be talking about my most recent novel, The Borgia Confessions, which takes place in Renaissance Italy, Renaissance Rome specifically, and is about the rise of one of Italy's most infamous families, the Borgias. So let me pull up, I have a PowerPoint here, so let me pull that up. I will go ahead and share my screen. So. Okay. Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see that. This novel came out, about a year ago now, last year in February. And interestingly enough, this was a novel that since I started my publishing career, I had always thought it was going to be my next book, sort of every time. So my debut novel, The Violinist of Venice, came out in 2015. At that point, when I had, sold that novel, my publisher gave me a 2-book deal. So I had a second book to write for them. And at first I wasn't sure what it was going to be. So I had started a version of this book back when I was in college. I always knew I wanted to write about the Borgias. So I kind of had some chapters, some scenes all scribbled down. So once I was sort of done with The Violinist of Venice and that was handed into my editor, I started noodling around with that. I sent the early chapters to my agent and I sort of thought, yeah, this is going to be the second book. So at that time, my agent liked it, but she said, I don't know. I think it's missing something. So I ended up writing, was my second published novel, The Most Beautiful Woman in Florence, after I finished that one and it was turned in. Same thing, I came back to those chapters. I had my agent read them again and she basically gave me the same feedback that, I really like what you have here. I like where this is going. I just feel like something's missing. And I should note that those early chapters, they were all from Cesare's point of view. So some of those are in the book. It was basically the prologue and I think chapter 2, what is now chapter 2. And then there was a third chapter that I had written that is not in the book. It ended up getting cut because I liked it, but I didn't need it. And so then at that point, I wrote my third book, The Spellbook of Katrina Van Tassel. And then once that was, off to my editor and it was time to start thinking about something new, I had actually a couple other projects I was playing around with and I sort of wasn't committed to anything. And my mind kept going back to this one. And I sort of had this lightning bolt moment where I thought back to a short story I had written in college, which was from the point of view of a maid who gets involved with Cesare Borgia. And I thought, okay, maybe that perspective is what this novel is missing. Maybe it needs the perspective of, this powerful member of this very powerful family, and it needs the perspective of somebody who is in a powerless position at that point of time. And so I was really excited. If there's any writers in the audience, I think you'll know when you get that idea or like that last piece of an idea, it's a very exciting feeling. So I went back to the chapters I had. I wrote some chapters from Madeleine's point of view and I kind of interspersed them with Cesare's point of view. I sent it to my agent. She also had the beginnings of the other projects I had been working on, and she kind of agreed that this was the one that felt like it was meant to be next. And I agree, because this was the one I was leaning towards. So then I was basically off to the races with this one. We were on the same page. It was great. And I eventually wrote it after trying and kind of having a few false starts with this one. So I'm just so thrilled that this one's out in the world. It means so much to me because, as I said, I've always wanted to write about the Borgias. I always had this book in me, and it just took a little while for all the pieces to fall into place. But I'm glad that they did. I think that it was certainly worth it. So yeah, let me tell you a little bit more about it. So this is kind of the synopsis of the book, which I won't read to you word for word, but the premise is that it's told from two alternating points of view, one being Cesare Borgia, who is the eldest son of Rodrigo Borgia, who of course went on to become Pope Alexander VI. And the other point of view is Madeleine Moretti, who she is a fictional character, and she's a maid who works for the Borgia family. And so again, it's kind of an upstairs, downstairs idea where I'm telling the story of a very tumultuous time in Italian political, military history through the point of view of both somebody who is, you know, kind of in the room where it happens, we could say, making decisions and with some power to affect everything that's going on. And then also from the point of view of somebody who, you know, as a domestic servant is kind of on the margins of society and is kind of a member of the lower class. And so she really is quite powerless in her world. And so that interplay of, you know, seeing those two points of view, I think was really interesting for me to explore. I certainly hope it makes the novel interesting to read. And then, you know, it examines as Madeleine kind of becomes entwined with the family and she learns some of their secrets and she gets enmeshed in all of the intrigue that's going on in the Borgia family. She kind of starts to find that she has a certain measure of power that she never expected to have. And so the novel follows, you know, how that changes her, how that changes the events that happen around her and around the Borgia family. So that is kind of the basic premise. So on these slides, I just kind of have some images that I'm going to sort of use to guide a little bit of what I'm talking about. But I figured I would talk a little bit about the history behind the novel and show you some of the people and the actual places that are featured in the novel, just to give you a little bit of context. And also, you know, if you haven't read the book, hopefully this inspires you to pick it up. But so here we have the Borgia family, kind of the main players. So in the center is Cesare, who is, of course, one of our narrators in the book. As I said, he's the eldest son of Rodrigo Borgia, or Alexander VI. When his father became Pope, he was made the Archbishop of Valencia. And then later on, he was made a cardinal. And he did not want to do either of those things. He was very much interested in being a soldier, being a commander, and sort of leading armies to try to further the glory of the Borgia family that way. But that was kind of not the plan that Rodrigo had for him. So over here in the upper left corner, that is a portrait of Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia. So he was elected Pope in 1492. He was Spanish. He was from the Catalan region of Spain. So kind of like where Barcelona, Valencia is over there on the east coast of Spain. So that led to him not being terribly popular in a lot of the circles of power of Rome, specifically, and Italy more broadly. They were suspicious of a foreigner, essentially, that they saw him as, even though at the time that he was elected Pope, he'd been a cardinal, he had risen through the church ranks, he had been living in Italy for a large portion of his life. But there was definitely this suspicion of him as sort of an outsider. I mentioned it in the author's note of the book, but you know, I don't remember the exact numbers, but of the total men in history that have been Pope, the overwhelming majority have been Italian. So the powerful families of Italy and of Rome in particular were kind of not happy that somebody who was not one of their own and who they didn't know if he was going to play by their rules, you know, was kind of in the top job. So directly beneath the portrait of Alexander VI is Lucrezia Borgia. She, at the time that her father was elected Pope, she was 13 years old. She is somebody who is pretty infamous in history, and I think very much undeservedly so. I think that most of the things that have been laid at her door. People say that she poisoned people, she murdered people, she was, doing all the scheming and things like that. There's not actually a lot of historical evidence for that, really, for any of that. I think that, quite frankly, she was the only woman in this infamous family. So I think that because of that, she tends to draw a lot more criticism than some of the rest. That's my personal opinion. But and like I said, when her father was elected Pope, she was only 13 years old. So I think that people tend to forget that when they cast her in this sort of like desperate, scheming temptress role. I mean, she was a child. So, I think that's important to remind people. So in my book, I was careful to portray her as I feel that she actually was, both based on my research and sort of based on the fact of her age. And, she was intelligent enough to know the situation she had found herself in, the situation her family was now in with her father as the Pope. She was highly intelligent, but, she was sort of innocent in a lot of ways of the things that were going on in this kind of cutthroat world of Italian politics, in which she ended up being used as a pawn, essentially, for, making politically advantageous marriages and things like that. So over here in the upper right corner is Juan Borgia, Duke of Gandia. He was the second son of Alexander, and he was the one who was chosen to sort of lead the armies in the family's name, do all the military things, while Cesare was sort of going to be helping his father out in the church and helping with all the politics on that side. The problem with this plan was that Juan was basically incompetent at anything he ever had to do. It's kind of interesting, as a novelist, you want to make sure that you're giving a lot of depth to your characters, and that you're making sure that, nobody's portrayed as really two-dimensional, and nobody's either a saint or a complete monster. But when I was researching the book, most historians don't really have a lot of nice things to say about Juan Borgia. They kind of all generally regard him as pretty terrible. By all accounts, he was cruel. He was, not the brightest. He kind of made a hash of everything that was set to him, which certainly came to a head, when his father did give him command of some armies and sent him out to do a little conquering. That didn't really go very well. So, of course, Cesare, having wanted to be the military one in the family, was incredibly jealous of his brother. They hated each other by all accounts. They did not get along. And I won't say too much else about Juan. If you know the history of the Borgia family, you kind of know what became of him. But in the interest of trying my best not to spoil certain things that happened in the book, I won't say anything more. And then on the bottom, below Juan, the bottom right-hand corner, that's Joffre Borgia, the youngest son. I should add the caveat that this portrait is allegedly of Joffre Borgia. It's one of those, you find this sometimes with Renaissance paintings, where there's a lot of portraits that are, supposedly of so-and-so, but they're not 100% sure. So that's kind of the situation here. But he was the youngest son of Rodrigo and his mistress Vanozza de Catanei, and who is the mother of all 4 of the children shown here. Although there was some controversy about whether Joffre was actually Rodrigo's son and not the son of Vanozza and her husband at the time, whose name is escaping me because she had 2 or 3. So I forget which one she was married to at that time. But yeah, so he's a little bit more inconsequential. He never really played any large part on the political or military stage of Italy or of Europe in the way that the other 3 did. So he sort of lived and died in not obscurity, but he never, like I said, never really was a big player in much that was going on. So one of the questions I get asked sometimes about this book is, why didn't I write from Lucrezia's point of view? As a woman who writes about women in history and women in Italian history specifically. And there's a couple answers to that question. One is sort of a practical consideration, in that, there are certainly other historical novels out there about the Borgia family. Mine's not the first, I'm sure it won't be the last. And there are several already from Lucrezia's point of view. And so given that, I sort of didn't feel like, while I do find her interesting, I sort of didn't feel that I had anything to say in telling a story from her point of view that hadn't already been said. So, there is obviously a little bit of a marketing consideration that comes into it when you're just, if you want to write for a publication, you want to try to do something that's a little bit different. So that's kind of the practical consideration. But with that said, I was never really as drawn to write from her point of view as I was to write from Cesare's. And the reason for that is that, to me, he is the true villain of the Borgia family. Certainly Pope Alexander was, though he was the Pope, he was certainly not a saint. He was guilty of a lot of terrible things. But, as I said before, Lucrezia gets this terrible reputation that I don't think was deserved. Juan ended up being inconsequential just because of how things sort of turned out for him. And, when you look at the whole story of how the Borgia saga kind of unfolded, I think that Cesare was the real villain. And so for that reason, he was the one that always fascinated me. I'm not sure what that says about me. But I always kind of wanted to write basically his villain origin story. So, how did he become the villain of the family, and how did he get to that point where he did a lot of the terrible things that, of course, we know that he did. One thing I did want to address too, though, and this is addressed not only in the novel, but also in the author's note that follows. One of the things that is commonly said about the Borgia families, and kind of one of the most notorious rumors about them, is that there were incestuous relationships amongst them. So the most prominent ones are that Lucrezia and Cesare had an incestuous relationship. So I've read that there were rumors that she had an incestuous relationship with her father, the Pope. There's some versions of it that say she was also having a sexual relationship with Juan. That's another thing that really there's no historical evidence for. And in fact, there's some evidence to the contrary. So, as much as historians seem to be pretty certain that none of that was true, again, as reasonably certain as you can be about what went on in people's bedrooms, hundreds of years ago, which of course you can never know 100%. But that rumor was actually born from the fact that when Lucrezia's marriage to her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, was annulled for political reasons, the way that they arranged the divorce was that they said that it was never consummated because Giovanni Sforza was impotent, which then as now is probably kind of an embarrassing thing for a man to have said about him. And, this was big news throughout Europe. So basically everyone in Europe was hearing that he was impotent. So one of the things that he supposedly said kind of in reaction to all of this is that the Pope and Cesare had arranged his divorce from Lucrezia so that they could have her all to themselves. And then that was all it took. The rumor was off like wildfire. People at the time were talking about it and were sort of spreading that rumor. And it was kind of fueled by the fact that the Borgia family, the father, children, and then especially Cesare and Lucrezia were very close. They had a very close personal relationship. Which not necessarily unusual in families, of course. And then given the fact that, again, the Borgias, as being of Spanish descent, were considered something of outsiders in Rome, it sort of makes sense that they would kind of band together. But of course, that's a very salacious rumor. It took off, it got repeated, and it got, of course, passed down to us through history. But you have to take, again, Giovanni Sforza was being very highly embarrassed throughout Europe. So he absolutely had an axe to grind with these folks. So I think that what he says should probably be taken with a pretty large grain of salt. So again, that's kind of the consensus and everything I've read, that mostly why this is not believed to be true. Again, can you ever know 100%? No, but that seems to be probably not something that really happened, although, it has made its way down to us through history, and it crops up in, other novels about the Borgias, or the Showtime TV show kind of went with that plot line, which I have lots of thoughts about that show, but that's not what we're talking about tonight. So I will leave it at that. So I think that's something really important to understand and to kind of put the novel in context, but also just, to understand the political landscape of Renaissance Italy is, it's really important to understand that Italy did not really exist. What we now know today as Italy was actually a group of multiple different countries, all ruled by different families, all with different systems of government. So this map is from the Encyclopedia Britannica, but this gives you a pretty good idea. All of these was all different countries. So the Papal States were under the secular leadership of the Pope. So he was the ruler of these lands, in addition to being, of course, the head of the church, the Catholic Church. What this map doesn't really show, and I couldn't find one I liked better that broke it down this way, but the Papal States had a lot of little city-states within them, and technically all of the leaders of those cities owed allegiance to the Pope as their feudal overlord. This was still, in this area, a system of feudalism. In theory. In practice, that was not really the case. What happened in practice was that the Pope and the Catholic Church, for a long time, by the time that Rodrigo Borgia was Pope, really had no military arm. They didn't really have much of a standing army. So they really had no way to enforce the Pope's dominance of pretty much anything in the Papal States. So what happened as a result was that a lot of the larger towns and cities in there kind of ended up being ruled by these warlords or these petty princes or whoever, and they kind of just ran things however they wanted to. They didn't send tribute to Rome as they were supposed to. And the Pope really just, practically, there was nothing he could do about it. So one of the things that Cesare wanted to do and that Pope Alexander wanted to do was reassert the dominance of the Vatican over the Papal States. Now, we can debate, you know, obviously the morality of war and conquest and things like that, but technically they were well within their rights, you know, under the system that existed at the time. This was something that the Pope, you know, he was in charge of all of this, and everybody else that was sort of ruling any kind of city-state in his name was usurping his authority. But then you see, you know, a lot of, most of Italy was actually part of the Kingdom of Naples. That was the only kingdom in Italy. So the King of Naples was the only actual king on the Italian peninsula. Siena, Florence, Milan, Genoa, they were all ruled by powerful families who got there, you know, kind of by right of conquest. In Florence with the Medici, it was a little bit more complicated than that. Florence was ostensibly a republic, but by the period of the 1490s in practice, Lorenzo de' Medici was actually basically the leader of Florence. How it got to be that way is a whole other story that we don't really have time for. But another fun fact is that the richest and most powerful nation in Europe in the 15th century and then into part of the 16th century was the Republic of Venice, which a lot of people don't realize. Like, that's not, when you learn about Europe in this period, in Europe of this period in school, that they kind of don't really talk about what was going on in Italy so much. But Venice, basically, they had all the cards. Their navy was pretty much invincible. They were extremely wealthy. As you can see, this is all part of Venice over here on the east coast of the Adriatic Sea. They had colonies there. They had holdings down into like what is today Greece, parts of Turkey. So they were very rich. In part of what happens in the novel is that King Charles of France invades to try to basically take his rights to the Kingdom of Naples. So the King of France and the King of Spain actually both had an ancestral claim to the throne of Naples. And so for various reasons, Charles decided, I'm going to march an army through Italy and I'm going to make myself King of Naples. That doesn't really work out for him, which is a long story, which is in the book. So I won't get too much into it today, but yeah, and so part of the reason that he was even able to invade was that Venice declared themselves neutral. Had they not done that, he probably would not have bothered, because even, you know, as large and wealthy a kingdom as France was, they probably would not have won against Venice. That's kind of just the military power and the sheer financial resources that Venice had at their disposal. So I won't talk too much more about that, because Venetian history is actually my other favorite, very nerdy topic. So I will not go on too much of a tangent about that. But that is relevant, and, you know, some of the politics that played into why King Charles chose to invade when he did. Well, first of all, the old King of Naples died, so he kind of had an opportunity there. But also Milan and Venice were kind of in conflict with each other. And so very long story short, Milan decided, well, I'm going to have the King of France come and protect me from you, Venice. You know, and Charles, having a vested interest in trying to make himself King of Naples, decided this was a good opportunity. At which point Venice decided to stay out of it, which they usually did unless there was something financially in it for them. They were kind of the consummate capitalists. But anyway, so like I said, to understand kind of the context in which the Borgias were in power and how and why the Renaissance sort of proceeded as it did, it's important to understand that Italy was made up of all these different countries. They all had their own agendas. And it ultimately was each of their individual downfall, because what happened after the first French invasion in 1494 was that they were really never rid of the major powers of Europe after that. So Charles eventually turned around and went back to France. He didn't get what he came for, but it kind of showed that Italy was not a united front, and there was a lot of wealth there, a lot of natural resources to be had. And so after that point, the French and the Spanish basically were, would invade at various times and kind of try to carve up the nations of Italy to best suit themselves, which pretty much continued for most of history in one form or another until Italy eventually did unify. The irony is that, in hindsight, of course, if all the nations of Italy had united in the first place, they could have absolutely kicked out the French and the Spanish, right from the beginning. But again, they were different countries. It seems obvious to us now, but they were different countries. They all had different agendas. So it just wasn't that simple as getting them all on the same page to understand that maybe this was in their common interest, because they didn't see it that way. They saw that Venice had a common interest, Milan had a common interest, and so forth. All right. So I also have some pictures of just various places in the book that are actual places that you can visit, because I thought that might be interesting for folks to see. So the previous pictures, the portraits, and obviously that map, as I mentioned, was from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Those I took from online. All these pictures I'm going to show I took myself while I was sort of doing various research trips for this book and others. I think there's pictures from a couple different trips in here. But this is the Castel San Angelo. This is my favorite building in Rome. Why is it my favorite? Not because it's the prettiest. It's certainly not, as you can probably see. It's really not much to look at. But I find the history of it extremely fascinating. So you can see, if you look at the pictures that show kind of the whole building here more on the left-hand side, you can kind of see, and it's really cool if you visit it and you stand at the bottom of that main central kind of cylinder and you look up, you can see it looks like a cake. There's all these layers built on top of each other. And that's because it was built onto and added onto over hundreds of years. So this building was originally built by the Roman Emperor Hadrian as a tomb for himself and his wife. That was its original intent. So sometimes you might see this building called Hadrian's Mausoleum, because that was the original purpose of it. And it was this big, enormous, squat building. And what happened eventually was that the popes took it over, enlarged it, added to it, put a wall around it, and made it into their fortress. And so this building was actually impregnable back in the day. Like you were not getting into this building without an invitation. This was as secure as it got. So it was the Pope's personal fortress. If shit went down, for lack of a better term, this is where he went, and pretty much nobody was going to get at him. So there's not really a good picture of it here, but there is actually a secret, like a walkway that runs kind of on top of a wall that connects the building to the Vatican Palace. So the Pope could, kind of secretly go from the Vatican Palace to the Castel San Angelo and back again if he needed. So part of the book takes place here when King Charles's armies do eventually get to Rome. The Pope, Cesare, some of his loyal cardinals, they all hole up here. And Madeleine is here as well, because at that time she is the maid for the Pope's mistress and her mother-in-law, don't ask. And so they were brought into the Castel San Angelo when the French were coming. So they were safe. So Madeleine is in there as well. So yeah. This picture over here on the right, you can kind of see like some of the ramparts and some of the areas. There's also rooms inside that are pretty fabulous. There are rooms in there that feel like a palace, and that's sort of where the Pope or some of his important guests would stay. Quick aside about the name. So clearly it's not, as I said, it's not called Hadrian's Mausoleum anymore. It's called the Castel San Angelo, which in English means the Castle of the Holy Angel. So you'll notice a statue at the top. That is St. Michael the Archangel. And how this building got its current name was that in, the 800s, so going way back, there was a really terrible plague that was rampaging through Rome. And so the Pope at the time led a procession past the Castel San Angelo to basically pray for the plague to end. So according to the legend, the Pope looked up, and on top of the Castel San Angelo, he saw a vision of St. Michael the Archangel sheathing his sword. And the Pope took this as a sign that the plague was at an end. And, you know, supposedly after that, the plague did end. So the building was renamed Castel San Angelo. And ever since then, supposedly, there has been a statue of St. Michael at the top. It's not always been the same statue. You know, this one was certainly not there during the Renaissance, but supposedly there has always been a statue of St. Michael up there at the top. And then I had to add this picture over here in the lower right-hand corner. That's me standing on the terrace up at the top. So there's a terrace kind of right beneath the statue. And there's a scene in the book where Cesare and Madeleine they stand up there and have a conversation. So where I'm standing in that picture is basically exactly where they would have been standing in the book talking to each other. So while I was there, I had to get a picture of myself standing in exactly that spot. Okay, so these pictures are all of the Borgia Apartments, which are in the Vatican Palace. And so if you go and tour the Vatican museums, these are open to the public. You can walk through them. They're kind of not terribly interesting other than for these frescoes that you see some of them here. What they do is they usually have other art exhibits set up in these rooms. It's a whole series of rooms. But when Rodrigo Borgia was elected Pope, he kind of took these rooms over and he hired painters to decorate them. So this bigger picture here in the bottom left, that is a fresco, and you might recognize in the center of it is a figure that, it's the same picture I showed you before of Lucrezia, but that is supposedly Lucrezia. She's depicting, I believe, St. Catherine of Alexandria here. Now I'm drawing a blank, but I think that that's what this scene is. And so over here on the horse is either Juan or Cesare, I always forget, but he kind of had his family members painted into this religious scene, which was not uncommon at the time. That happened all the time in Renaissance art, where patrons would commission a picture of some kind of religious scene, and then they would want themselves and or their family painted into it as various players in the scene. The picture above that's part of the ceiling. You can probably tell because you can see the top of the window there. Over here in the upper right, this is not a great picture, I apologize, but because of the angle, that's up against the ceiling, and that figure in the gold robes on the left there who's kneeling in prayer, that is Rodrigo Borgia. So he had himself painted into that section of it. And then in the lower right, that's tough to see too, but there's a fireplace there, and that what's over it is the papal seal, which you can tell it has the what's called the papal tiara, which is not what we think of as a tiara. It's like this massive kind of conical hat that's very fancy and probably very heavy. And it's crossed over the keys, which represent the keys of heaven, because the Pope is the successor to St. Peter, is the keeper of the keys to heaven. And then again, it's tough to see in this picture, but on the left side of that crest is the Borgia bull, which was the symbol of the Borgia family. So, he had the papal crest painted on there with the symbol of his family. And then this picture kind of in the center at the top here is really nothing special. This just kind of struck me when I was in there hanging out in these rooms for like an hour and just kind of like soaking in the vibes, because that's what I do. But I kind of liked this, and I sort of thought it looked like a good place to sit and plot shady business. So there is actually a scene in the book where the Pope and Cesare are sitting in that spot and they are plotting shady business. So I had to include that picture for that reason. But that window looks out into the courtyard of the Vatican Palace. And then just another fun fact about the Borgia Apartments, but Alexander VI's successor, Julius II, he was not the next Pope after Alexander VI, there was one in between them. But he had long been Rodrigo Borgia's big enemy. And so when he became Pope, he had these rooms completely boarded up. Nobody was allowed in. Nobody was even allowed to talk about them. They just kind of sat. And they kind of stayed that way for a long time. And then, as you see, they've obviously been uncovered and restored, and you can go visit them. So this slide is kind of just a collection of some other pictures relevant to places in the book. So up in the upper right over here, that is the interior of Santa Maria in Trastevere, which Trastevere is a neighborhood in Rome that traditionally was kind of a poorer, more working class neighborhood. So there's a scene in the book where Madeleine goes there to pray. So that is the interior of that church there. Over kind of on this side of the slide, we have Florence. There is a part of the book that takes place in Florence to do with Girolamo Savonarola, who was brief encapsulation of that story because it's a very long story. But he sort of took control of Florence after the death of Lorenzo de' Medici. He was a Dominican friar, and he preached and he drew in a lot of followers, especially amongst, poor, lower class, working class people. He preached against, well, a lot of things, but primarily against the church, and what he felt was the corruption of the Catholic Church, popes having mistresses and committing simony, selling church offices. He was not wrong about any of that, to be perfectly clear, like that was all happening. But he also preached against a lot of what made the Renaissance what it was, people kind of rediscovering ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, all the painting, people wearing fine clothes and things like that. So he's a really, really interesting historical figure. If you're ever interested in learning more about him, I do recommend it, because there's just a lot going on with him. Like some of his instincts as far as reforming the church, I think were noble ones. But he also, had he had his way, would have probably taken Italy back to the Dark Ages in a lot of ways. So he's kind of a mixed bag. So there is a plot where one of our characters goes to Florence to kind of find out what's going on there. So this is the Duomo in Florence, which is the big cathedral. This picture up here in the center, that's the interior of the Duomo, which Savonarola used to preach in the Duomo on occasion. And so there's a scene where he does so in the book. So that is what the inside of it looks like. And then this spot, I guess quick spoiler, but this is a historical thing that happened, so it's not really a spoiler. But Savonarola was eventually burned at the stake for heresy and kind of disobeying the church. He got excommunicated a bunch of times and things like that, because he was undermining the Pope's authority, which the Pope couldn't have, so he had to get rid of him. But this, so in the upper left corner here, this is a plaque on the spot in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence where he was actually burned at the stake. So it has his name. There were actually two of his brother friars were burned at the same time. So their names are on there. The date, which I cannot tell you because I cannot read Roman numerals, so I don't exactly know what that says, but just his name, it says what happened, etc. And then this picture in the lower right here, so that's Mount Vesuvius. Naples is kind of spread beneath it, and then that's the Bay of Naples. And so I include that not because any of the action of the book that we see takes place there, but a lot of it, as I said, has to do with King Charles's invasion of Italy and his desire to get to Naples, conquer it, and become king of Naples. And so it's funny, just like I said, none of the action ended up taking place in Naples, but there's so much talk about it, and there's so much people are concerning themselves with what's happening there. So I kind of wanted to include that picture, but also because when I stood there taking that picture, I was standing in Sorrento, which is across the Bay of Naples. I remember standing there and thinking, this is extremely beautiful. I understand why King Charles went to all the trouble, because it was a lot of trouble. He had to drag a whole army and a lot of cannon over the Italian hills, which I'm sure was no small feat. But when you stand there and see how beautiful it is, I kind of get it. And just kind of as a personal aside, it was really fun when I was putting together these slides to look at all these pictures again and kind of dig through all my folders and find the ones I wanted and remember that, hey, I used to go places. That was fun. We don't do that anymore. And then a couple other kind of tangentially related locations. On the left is San Giovanni in Laterno, which is the basilica that is technically the seat of the Bishop of Rome. The Bishop of Rome is, of course, the Pope. But what's interesting is that he doesn't actually officially become Pope until he goes to this church and kind of, there's actually a literal seat that he has to sit in, and then that's when he's officially the Pope. So this is actually not near Vatican City at all. It's a couple of miles across Rome. This church gets mentioned in the book. There were a lot of, during the Renaissance, there were a lot of, masses and kind of official church things that happened there. The facade that you see there would not have been there in the Renaissance, but that particular church has been there for a very long time. And then over on the right is a building that you were maybe expecting to see earlier on in this slideshow. That is, of course, St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City and St. Peter's Square. This current iteration of St. Peter's Basilica had not been built yet, nor had this iteration of St. Peter's Square. There was always a basilica on this spot. It was always St. Peter's Basilica, and the square in front of it was always St. Peter's Square. But the current square was designed by Bernini, and the current basilica was Michelangelo, built the dome, and that was actually begun in the time of Pope Julius II. So this version of the basilica was not there, but as I said, there was always a St. Peter's Basilica. We just don't have a ton of information about what the old one looked like. Unlike this one, of course. But yeah, so the St. Peter's that is people are spending time in and things in the book would not have looked like this. So, but I figured I would mention it because it's pretty amazing. So it's always worth having a picture of it. And that is my presentation. So got very nerdy there about the Borgias and about Renaissance Italy, but as you see, these are my other books as well, if you're interested. So I will stop there, and I am certainly happy to take some questions if you guys have them.
Yeah, we do have some questions here. Let's start with, let's see, Katie says, Alyssa, do you have any advice for an author interested in beginning to write historical fiction?
Sure. So, gosh, yeah, where to start? So, of course, know that you're going to have to do a lot of research. But also, I think it's important to realize that that doesn't necessarily mean reading everything in books. So I always recommend travel if possible. Of course, that's not possible so much right now. But I think sometimes people looking to write historical fiction overlook all of the other great sources that are out there. So it depends very much on the time period. So depending how recent the time period you're looking at is, you might have photographs, you might have music that was written and recorded in that time period, things of that nature. If you're going further back, with the Renaissance particularly, what I love to look at are paintings and particularly portraiture, because those give you an idea of what people wore, how they wore their hair, kind of how they presented themselves, which is of course not necessarily how they looked or went about their daily life, but I think that still tells you something about them. And then, as I mentioned before, a lot of times you had religious scenes with contemporary people, and they were sometimes put in contemporary settings. So Botticelli painted an Adoration of the Magi that's set in the Tuscan countryside. So you can kind of get a feeling for like what the landscape looked like. The people in the painting, kind of coming to visit the baby Jesus are dressed sort of as Tuscan Florentine noblemen. So I think paintings are a really good source, again, depending how far you're going back. And then if you can't visit a place, like Google Maps and things like that are really great to get a view of what it is that you're, where things are taking place. Maps are good. I think I said photographs if that's available, music from the time period, even. So for instance, with the Violinist of Venice, there's a lot about Vivaldi's music. So I listened to a lot of his music, so clearly it wasn't recorded when he was alive, but music that was written at the time, classical music or what have you, I think that can kind of give you an insight into what people were like at that time. So I guess all of this to say that I think, keep yourself open to all the different forms of research. Yes, you're going to have to do a lot of reading, but there's other sources that I think are really valuable to consult. And it also kind of helps shake up the research and keep it interesting. So I think that would probably be my advice.
And that sounds like great advice. Susan asks, when did popes cease having families? Not being Catholic, I was surprised to learn that popes were married with children.
So they were not married, and they were not supposed to have children. The popes and the clergy have been expected to be celibate for most of the Catholic Church's history. So I kind of should have led with that, but I sort of forget that people are surprised by that because I've been so immersed in this history that it just no longer ceases to surprise me, but that is definitely a surprising thing for people. So, gosh, I don't know. I couldn't tell you the last pope who kind of openly had a mistress and children, but they kind of cut back on that after the Reformation because that was one of the things that Martin Luther kind of criticized about the church was there was a lot of hypocrisy where priests, cardinals, popes were supposed to be celibate. They weren't. And so that was kind of part of his issue with the Catholic Church, and rightfully so. I mean, practice what you preach, right? So around the Reformation, that kind of ceased being quote unquote acceptable in the sense that, in the Renaissance and earlier, it was kind of an open secret. And some popes would refer to their children as nieces and nephews, but everybody knew that it was not really. So yeah, so to be clear, he was not supposed to have children or a mistress or any of that, but so many of the popes and cardinals and powerful men of the church did for a very long time.
Okay, here's another question. I think you might have actually answered this, but is the Hadrian building you showed in Rome near the Vatican?
Yes, yeah, so it's very close. So it's actually, if you're standing and facing the Castel San Angelo, directly to your left is St. Peter's Square. Like if you turn this way, you're going to be looking straight down the road and right at the front of St. Peter's. And yeah, like I said, the two buildings are actually connected. There's actually a walkway that runs from the Castel San Angelo to the Vatican Palace, and that was how the Pope would get to the fortress in a hurry if he needed to.
Okay, the Borgia is obviously a massive historical research dive. How did you pick and choose what was relevant to this book?
Oh, that's such a good question. So that was really hard. And actually, the things that I left out of this book, because I just didn't have time or pages to even get into them, I could write a whole other book about the things that I left out. So it was sort of self-selecting in a way, because I was able to focus on, okay, this section is from Cesare's point of view. What was he doing at this time? And what was he concerned with? So I was able to kind of filter out a little bit that way. And then with Madeleine being a fictional character, I had a lot of flexibility with her where I could kind of insert her into things that really did happen and just also kind of insert her into other fictional scenarios. So that was nice. But yeah, it's really just a matter of kind of wading through all of the things that happened in this time period and kind of wrangling it into a cohesive narrative. So actually the plot line I mentioned about Savonarola in Florence and kind of how the church dealt with that actually was not in the first draft, because I had so many other plot threads to wrangle that I just didn't deal with it. And then when I got to revisions, I was like, okay, this was a seriously major event that happened in the Renaissance. This cannot not be in the book. So I have to figure out a way to work it in. So I did a lot of layering with this book. As you say, it was a massive kind of research lift. So I had to kind of layer in all of the different pieces. But yeah, I tried to keep it in a cohesive narrative arc where not too much was going on at the same time. I shifted the dates of when some things actually happened, which I talk about in the author's note. But just to simplify things for both the reader and myself by making not too many things happen at a time. So I kind of went through and I thought, okay, what are the most important events that happened in this time period for my characters? And then also, what are the events that had kind of the best dramatic impact and would sort of fit with the narrative? And I kind of went from there. And like I said, it was a process and it took lots of layers and lots of revisions, but I think I did a good job.
I think you did too. I read the book. Related to that, and this is my question, was it hard to balance the historical information with the entertainment factor when you were writing it? I mean, it is historical fiction, so you want people to, enjoy reading it.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why I chose not to cram in every actual historical event, because I have read historical fiction that does that. And I think that the danger there sometimes is that it starts to read a little bit like a textbook, because you can kind of feel the author, adhering to accuracy. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that it's important to make it also entertaining. So I think that there were certain events that kind of detracted from the main plot that I decided, I don't think this is necessary. And I think that so maybe you leave out some things that really happened, but in the end you get a tighter, a more interesting story that keeps people engaged. So, you're kind of making those choices the whole way through as you're writing.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I think that's why it's, I am a fan of historical fiction. So I can't wait to get to the author's notes at the end, because I want to find out, okay, what was true, what wasn't, and so
yes.
So your notes were much appreciated. Okay, another patron question: what languages were being spoken in the various states? Was Latin an official language of the papacy?
So yes, so a lot of the official church business was conducted in Latin still at this time. Interestingly enough, one of the things that did sort of make the Italian peninsula a little bit of a cohesive unit in theory was that they were speaking the same language. So they did speak Italian. It was, an early modern form of Italian. So, just like you think of kind of medieval English was different than the English we speak today. It was sometimes referred to as Tuscan, because what has evolved into the modern Italian language was really first spoken and developed in Tuscany. So pretty much in, again, the Italian peninsula, yeah, your average person spoke Italian or some dialect thereof. Like, for instance, there still exists today a Venetian dialect that is very different from Italian. There's a Neapolitan dialect, you know, like a lot of countries, there's all different dialects. Yes, at the Vatican, Latin was kind of the language that business was done in. Upper class people probably would have also learned French and Spanish. And then the Borgia family in particular spoke Catalan, which is a language still spoken in Catalonia today in Spain. People think of it as a dialect of Spanish, but it's not. It's its own language. So they would have spoken amongst themselves. They would have spoken Catalan.
Interesting. So what drew you to Cesare's earlier history as opposed to what comes later in the story?
Well, so I wanted this to be his villain origin story. So I wanted this to be, how did he get to where he ended up? So yeah, I kind of wanted to start out when he's a lot younger and he's kind of starting to feel his way through the world, and he kind of keeps getting thwarted in his ambitions of, you know, military greatness, and he keeps being told by his father, no, you have to stay in the church, and kind of tracing that emotional arc and how he got from there, like I said, to where he ended up. And actually one of the characters I looked to for inspiration for Cesare when I was writing him was Walter White from Breaking Bad, because I wanted it to be a similar arc in that you start out with this guy who you like, you're sympathetic to him, and then he kind of starts to lose you as he gets worse and worse. So that was sort of my model a little bit for Cesare.
Interesting. And so when you first, and you said you kept coming back to this book, when you the first go round with trying to write it, were you drawn to that because of Cesare, or was it more because Renaissance is your favorite historical time period, or what was it?
I mean, it was a little bit of the Renaissance, but yeah, it was always Cesare, and everything I've ever read about the Borgias, whether it was fiction, nonfiction, he's the one I kind of always am captivated by for whatever reason. And yeah, I like to explore shades of gray, and I like to explore, you know, what makes people tick. Yeah, so it really was him. I mean, the whole family, the whole time period, I'm kind of fascinated by it all. But yeah, he was the one that always drew my interest the most, again, for whatever reason.
Interesting. Okay, Katie wants to know, did you have any concerns about including Madeleine as a completely fictional character in the story?
No, I mean, I think that's one of the fun things about historical fiction that it allows us to do, is it allows us to add in, you know, the fiction and blend the fiction and the history. So yeah, I mean, you know, some historical authors prefer to stick to specifically what is known, or to write kind of strictly biographical historical fiction. But I like to play. I like to kind of play in the blank spaces of history, and I like to build on what we know and kind of take it in a different direction. So yeah, I mean, for me as a creative choice, that didn't really give me any pause. And I liked, as I mentioned before, I liked the freedom it gave me to kind of insert her into certain events as I saw fit, or have her, you know, she kind of has her own little storyline going for a little bit. And so, yeah, that was fun for me as a writer. And she was a good perspective to have in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So there's two other questions here. I'm going to ask them together because they sort of go together. Would you also be interested in writing about the Medicis? And are you allowed to tease any future projects?
So The Most Beautiful Woman in Florence is actually about the Medici family quite a bit. So the protagonist of that novel is actually a real historical figure. Her name was Simonetta Vespucci. If the name Vespucci sounds familiar, it's probably because America was named after Amerigo Vespucci, who was a cousin of Simonetta's husband, but I digress. But she is actually supposedly the woman in Botticelli's painting, The Birth of Venus. And she and her husband were very much a member of the Medici family's inner circle. So the book it's not directly about them, but, you know, she gets to become friends with them. She, again, is part of their social circle. So it's a look at kind of the early Medici years. This is when Lorenzo was kind of coming to power in Florence. But yeah, they are fascinating. I would never say no to writing another book about a member of that family potentially. I don't have any plans to do so, but they're very fascinating too. Yeah, it would be fun to kind of dig into their story a little bit more. As for future projects, so what I'm working on now is actually quite different. It's set in New York City in 1898, which is a different setting and a different time period for me. And it's been really interesting writing about such a recent time period, relatively speaking, to the rest of my books. And that's kind of been, that has like its own research challenges, but it also in some ways makes the research easier. Like in particular, writing about New York City is great because New York City is extremely well documented. So pretty much anything you want to know, like, was this building here? Was, this structure here? Like, you could do a quick Google search and there's just all this information. So that's been nice because there are certain things that I can find in a quick Google search where in the Renaissance, I'd be down a rabbit hole for quite a long time.
Sounds interesting. We're going to look forward to that. We just have a couple more questions and we are almost out of time. So Janet wants to know, who was the artist that painted the murals of the Borgia rooms?
Oh gosh, Pinturicchio, I think is his name. Hold on, it's in the book. I have the book right here. Let me look real quick. Sorry, I can't find it. I'm pretty sure his name was Pinturicchio. So Pinturcchio. I'm pretty sure, like 99% sure.
Okay, and how did you select the title Borgia Confessions?
Oh my God, that's a story in itself. This book had so many titles, and its titles are not usually something that I struggle with. So this was kind of its own thing. So when I sold the book, it was called The Keeper of the Keys, which I mentioned, the Pope is kind of considered the keeper of the keys of heaven. So that's where that came from. I never loved it. It was kind of always a working title. I brainstormed for a while. When I turned it into my editor, it was called Angels of Holy Vengeance, which there's a line in the book to that effect. So that's where I got that from. That got vetoed because by basically the publisher's marketing team, because they try to steer away from anything that is like too religious sounding, because they're afraid that that will kind of steer people away from it, which I get. But then I was kind of like, this is literally like 500 pages of church politics. Like, what else am I supposed to call it? My editor and I called it The Merciless Ones for a hot minute. I didn't like that. And then we landed on In the Shadow of Saints, which I really, really liked. We had been back and forth. She and I had a Google Doc that we kept opening and like writing down titles, and we would email back and forth, and like one of us would always veto something. And then when my editor did what's called the in-house launch at the publisher, where she kind of presents her list of books that are publishing pretty much a year from then, In the Shadow of Saints got vetoed again by kind of the marketing folks, because they wanted the name Borgia in the title, because people know the Borgias. They're kind of a perennially popular family. So they wanted that in the title as a selling point. So I was kind of back to the drawing board. So I went back to my list of titles and kind of narrowed it down again to things that had Borgia in the name. I really liked Servants of the House of Borgia. That kind of got vetoed. It was like a little too long. And we finally landed on the Borgia Confessions because if you've read the book, there are a lot of scenes of confession in the book, both formal confession in the sense of the Catholic Church sacrament of making confession, and then also people confessing things to other people in kind of more casual settings. So it seemed to really fit for that reason. So that was kind of where we landed, and everybody was happy. I was happy. My editor was happy. The marketing and sales folks at the publisher were happy. So yes, that's quite the saga, but that's how I got the title.
That's a great story. So I think we are out of time. So I want to thank Alyssa for being with us tonight. It was a fascinating hour. We really enjoyed it. And I want to encourage everyone to read her book. It's really a great book. And I did appreciate learning a lot tonight, and it'll serve you well when you read the book. So do pick it up and enjoy it. Thank you, Alyssa, again. And thank you to everybody who's listening, and have a great night.